The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and fresh flowers nobody had actually sent her. Naomi Everhart lay in the center of a cream-colored recovery suite on the 14th floor of Meridian Medical Center, her body still heavy from the anesthesia that had pulled her under 18 hours ago. The emergency surgery had been successful. That was what the nurses kept saying, their voices soft and careful, the way people speak to someone they are afraid might break. Successful, as though the word alone could stitch everything back together. She was 34 years old, and she had never felt more alone in her life. The foreline ran from a bag of saline into the back of her left hand. The monitors beside her beeped in a slow, steady rhythm. Outside the tall windows, the city of Hartwell spread itself in every direction, glass towers catching the morning light. Traffic already thick on the bridges below, the world going about its business with absolutely no interest in the woman lying still in room 1407. Naomi had been awake for 2 hours by the time she heard the footsteps in the corridor. She recognized them before the door opened. That particular rhythm, confident and slightly impatient, shoes striking the floor like each step was a small announcement. 6 years of marriage had taught her the sound of Tristan Calloway better than she knew her own heartbeat. She closed her eyes for just a moment. Not because she was afraid, because she wanted one more second of not knowing what was about to happen. The door swung open. Tristan walked in first. He was wearing his charcoal briny suit, the one she had picked out for him 2 Christmases ago, and his jaw was set in that particular way that meant he had rehearsed whatever he was about to say at least a dozen times. He was still handsome. That was the thing nobody warned you about. That someone could do something unforgivable and still be handsome. He didn't look at her when he entered. He looked at the window, and then the woman behind him stepped into the room, and Naomi understood everything. Camille Laurent moved the way women move when they are certain they are being watched. She was 27, slender except for the gentle but unmistakable curve of her belly, and she wore a pale blue dress that seemed specifically chosen to make that curve visible. Her hair was loose. Her makeup was flawless. She looked like someone who had spent considerable time preparing to be seen in a hospital room. Behind Camille came a man Naomi didn't recognize at first, silver-haired, carrying a leather portfolio, his face arranged in an expression of professional neutrality. Then she placed him, Martin Kessler, one of the most expensive divorce attorneys in the state. And behind him, filling the doorway with the particular energy of people who believe a room belongs to them by birthright, came Graham and Veronica Calloway, Tristan's parents. They had not called ahead. None of them had called ahead. Naomi had been out of surgery for less than 24 hours, and they had come without warning, without flowers, without anything that resembled concern. Naomi looked at all of them and said nothing. It was Veronica who broke the silence first. She always did. Veronica Calloway was 61 years old and had spent every one of those years perfecting the art of delivering cruelty with the tone of someone bestowing a kindness. She walked to the chair beside the window, not the chair closest to the bed, not the chair of someone who had come to offer comfort, and sat down like she was settling into a meeting she had been looking forward to. "You look pale," Veronica said. "But that's to be expected." Graham stood behind her, his arms folded, his eyes moving around the room as though he were already calculating what things were worth. Tristan finally turned from the window and looked at Naomi. Something crossed his face, something that might have been guilt if it had lasted more than a half-second. And then it was gone, replaced by the rehearsed expression he had prepared for this. "Naomi," he said, "I think you know why we're here." "I just had surgery, Tristan." "I know, and I'm sorry about that." "I am. But this couldn't wait any longer." Martin Kessler stepped forward and set his leather portfolio on the rolling tray beside Naomi's bed. He unzipped it with the practiced efficiency of a man who had delivered bad news to sick people before and had made his peace with it. Inside the portfolio were documents. Thick ones. The kind that have multiple copies and require signatures in a dozen places. But before he could say anything, Camille Laurent moved. She reached into her small clutch purse and withdrew a photograph. Ultrasound paper, the kind that comes printed in that pale gray that makes everything look like a ghost. She leaned forward and set it on Naomi's meal tray, right beside the untouched cup of apple juice the morning nurse had brought an hour ago. She set it there and then stepped back, and the expression on her face was not triumphant. Exactly. It was something more careful than that. Something that had been arranged. This child, Veronica said, and her voice was warm now, the warmth of someone toasting a victory, will finally give our family a future. Naomi looked at the ultrasound. Then she looked at Camille's belly. Then she looked at Tristan, who was looking at the floor. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She did not say any of the 100 things that were moving through her in that moment like a current she could feel but could not see. She looked at the ultrasound photograph on her meal tray for exactly 4 seconds, and then she looked at Martin Kessler. "Show me the documents," she said. The terms were, as terms go, a masterpiece of erasure. Martin Kessler walked her through each page with a careful, slightly apologetic cadence of someone who knows the papers are unfair but has been paid enough not to say so. The divorce settlement, as structured, required Naomi to surrender all financial claims against Tristan, all rights to assets accumulated during the marriage, and all future interests in any Calloway family enterprise. There was a clause about clean separation that appeared 3 times in slightly different language, as though someone had specifically wanted to make sure she couldn't find a loophole. She had signed a prenuptial agreement when she married Tristan. She had signed it without a lawyer because she was 28 and in love, and because Tristan had looked at her with those dark eyes and said, "This is just a formality, Naomi. This is just paper." She had believed him. She had believed, for the 6 years that followed, that the life they built together meant more than paper. She had been wrong. The settlement provides for a single payment, Kessler explained, his voice carefully neutral, in the amount of $250,000 as final and complete compensation for the duration of the marriage. Graham Calloway, from his position by the wall, made a sound that was almost approving. $250,000. For 6 years. For the debt she had paid when Tristan's first business failed. For the midnight phone call she had handled when vendors threatened to walk. For the charity gala she had organized, the relationship she had cultivated, the quiet interventions nobody had ever bothered to acknowledge or credit. $250,000. She took the pen Martin Kessler offered. She signed every page. She signed slowly and carefully, the way she did everything. And when she was finished, she set the pen down on the tray beside the ultrasound photograph. Then she pressed the call button beside her bed. Nurse Miller appeared within 30 seconds. A young woman with efficient hands and kind eyes who had checked on Naomi every 2 hours since the surgery. "Mila," Naomi said quietly, "I need you to make a copy of these documents before they leave with Mr. Kessler. And keep the original copy in the medical records office downstairs, sealed, with my name on it." Mila looked at the documents and then at the people filling the room and then back at Naomi. "Of course, Mrs. Everhart. I'll take care of it right now." Tristan frowned. "That's not necessary, Naomi. We'll provide." "It's already done," Naomi said. Something about her voice made him stop. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't emotional. It was simply done, the way a door sounds when it closes all the way, the latch clicking into place with quiet finality. Veronica stood. She smoothed her jacket. She looked at Naomi the way one might look at furniture being removed from a house, with a mild satisfaction that the space was being cleared. "We'll see ourselves out," she said. They left. All of them. Tristan last. He paused in the doorway for just a moment, his hand on the frame, and Naomi thought he might say something. Something real. Something that would at least acknowledge what 6 years of her life had meant to him. But he looked at her face, and whatever he saw there must have told him there were no words for this, because he left without saying one. The room was quiet. Naomi looked at the ultrasound photograph still sitting on her meal tray. She picked it up carefully with 2 fingers, turned it over, and set it face down. Then she lay back against her pillow and looked at the ceiling and breathed. She had met Tristan Calloway at a fundraiser for Children's Hospital Technology. She had been 27 and newly promoted to the leadership of her mother's company, Helix One Systems, which at the time most people had never heard of. He had been 30, charming, already starting to build the health alliance that would eventually carry the Calloway name. And he had looked at her across a room full of people and walked directly to her as though she were the only fixed point in the space. She remembered thinking he was the most deliberate person she had ever met. She had not been wrong about that. What she hadn't understood then was the difference between deliberate and intentional. Deliberate meant he always knew what he was doing. Intentional would have meant he was doing it for reasons that included her. Their courtship had been fast and certain, the way some things are when you are young and accomplished and both believe you are building something together. She had loved him the way she did most things, quietly, thoroughly, without needing to announce it. When he proposed, she said yes before he finished the question. When his first business venture collapsed under a mountain of vendor debt 8 months into their marriage, she had handled it the way she handled problems, methodically, without drama, writing checks and making calls until the bleeding stopped. She hadn't told him the full extent of what she'd done, not because she wanted to hide it, but because she hadn't wanted him to feel diminished. She understood, even then, that certain men carried their pride like a second skeleton, and if you jarred it too hard, something vital cracked. So she had moved quietly. She had always moved quietly. When Calloway Health Alliance began its first major expansion 3 years into the marriage, it needed infrastructure, medical record systems, data management, compliance architecture, the kind of invisible, critical scaffolding that nobody thinks about until it fails. Naomi arranged for Helix One to provide those services. She arranged it carefully, through third-party agreements that didn't visibly connect her to the decisions, at pricing that was, to put it plainly, extraordinarily favorable to the Calloways side. She told herself it was because she believed in what they were building together. She told herself that for 3 more years. 14 months before the morning in the hospital room, Naomi had discovered the first text message. She hadn't been looking for it. She had picked up Tristan's phone to check the time because her own was charging across the room, and the screen had lit up with a preview that she couldn't unread. I know this is complicated, but I can't stop thinking about you. See, she had set his phone down. She had gone into the bathroom and stewed over the sink for 4 minutes with the cold water running. Then she had gone back to bed and lain in the dark beside her husband and thought about what to do with information that changes everything and nothing at the same time. She had not confronted him that night. She had not confronted him for 3 months. She had spent those 3 months doing something much more careful. She had gone back to Helix One. She had reviewed every contract, every pricing structure, every agreement that existed between her company and Calloway Health Alliance. She had sat with her attorneys and walked through every document, every clause, every dependency. She had learned, in those 3 months, the precise weight of everything she had quietly given. And she had done one other thing. She had amended Helix One's governance documents so that certain protections, the pricing agreements, the deferred payment schedules, the emergency intervention protocols, were explicitly tied, in legal language, to her personal status as a Calloway family affiliate. The language was elegant in its specificity. She had her attorneys draft it, and she had read it 3 times, and then she had signed it, and then she had put it away. And she had waited. The hospital released her 6 days after the surgery. The car that came for her was not Tristan's. She hadn't expected it to be. She had called Rebecca Sterlington from her hospital bed on day 3. Rebecca, who had been her mother's attorney before she was Naomi's, who wore blazers the color of thunderclouds and had a way of reading documents that made other lawyers uncomfortable because she always found the thing they'd missed. I received the papers, Rebecca had said on the phone. No greeting, no preamble. That was Rebecca, and I'd like you to come in when you're able. There are some things to discuss. Are they interesting things? A pause. The kind Rebecca only made when something had genuinely surprised her. Naomi, they are extraordinarily interesting things. The car took her to her apartment. She had arranged the apartment 3 weeks before the hospitalization, before anyone knew she was sick, because she had understood by then that the marriage was ending one way or another. It was on the 22nd floor of a building 15 minutes from Helix One's headquarters. The movers had already brought what she'd packed. It wasn't much. She stood in the empty living room on her first night back and looked out at the city. She was not okay. She wanted to be honest about that, at least to herself, in the privacy of an empty room. She was not okay. The surgery had left her fragile in ways the doctors could measure and ways they couldn't. The marriage had left something behind too. Something that hurt in a different register than physical pain, lower and more persistent. She had given 6 years of her intelligence and her money and her care to a man who had sat in a hospital room where she lay recovering from surgery and handed her papers to sign. She had given, and she would not do it again. But that was tomorrow. Tonight she allowed herself the one thing she almost never allowed. She stood at the window and she let herself feel all of it, the grief and the anger, and underneath both of them, something quieter and more certain, something that had been growing in her since that night with the text message and the cold water running. She was ready. 3 weeks after leaving the hospital, Naomi sat across from Rebecca Sterlington in the firm's corner office, her hands folded in her lap, listening to her attorney explain the situation with the particular precision that had made Rebecca one of the most sought-after legal minds in the state. "The divorce settlement is signed and filed," Rebecca said. "That part is done. But the settlement contains a clause, and this is the Calloways' own language. Their own attorney drafted it, requiring complete and total separation of all financial and corporate interest between you and the Calloway family or its related entities." "I know," Naomi said. "What they did not know," Rebecca continued, and she picked up a document from the neat stack on her desk and held it up, "is what that actually means." Naomi said nothing. She waited. Helix One Systems is not a vendor to Calloway Health Alliance. Rebecca set the document down. "Technically, contractual, given the governance structure you amended 14 months ago, Helix One Systems is the vendor. The foundational vendor. The pricing structures alone, Naomi, the differential between what Calloway has been paying and market rate is approximately $400 million over 6 years. The number sat in the room between them. And the deferred payment schedules," Rebecca went on, "have been structured in a way that means at least $160 million in obligations are currently suspended. Those suspensions, as written, are conditional upon your continuing status as a Calloway affiliate, which I no longer am. Which you no longer are." Rebecca folded her hands. They demanded a clean break. They will get one. Outside the window behind Rebecca's desk, a pigeon landed on the sill, looked in, and flew away. "What's the timeline?" Naomi asked. 60 days for formal notice under the contracts. But the initial notices can go out whenever you authorize them. Naomi thought about the ultrasound photograph on the meal tray. She thought about Veronica Calloway's voice. "This child will finally give our family a future." "Send the notices," she said. Owen Prescott had worked for Helix One for 11 years, and in those 11 years he had watched Naomi Everhart grow from the daughter of the company's founder into something that genuinely awed him, not because of the wealth or the position, but because of the quality of mind. She thought the way surgeons operated. He used to tell people, "Clean, deliberate, no movement wasted." He sat across from her in the Helix One boardroom on a Tuesday morning and laid out the picture she already knew but needed confirmed. "For 6 years," he said, "Calloway Health Alliance has been operating under cost structures that are, I want to be careful here, extraordinary. In their favor, the licensing fees for the patient data architecture alone should be running them about $60 million a year. They've been paying $9. Naomi nodded slowly. "The emergency protocols, the 2 occasions in the last 3 years where their systems failed and we intervened overnight to prevent records loss. Those interventions, billed at standard rates, would have run about $22 million combined. We billed them 4.5. Owen paused. Nobody at Calloway ever questioned it. They never asked why. They just accepted it, Naomi said. Accepted it, and expanded on the assumption that these costs were fixed. He looked at her directly. "Naomi, if the contracts restructure to market rate and the deferred obligations activate, Calloway Health Alliance will have to find, conservatively, $240 million in the next 18 months that they currently do not have. And Summit Crest Partners, who holds their expansion loans, will almost certainly react. How will they react? The expansion projects are collateralized against operational stability metrics. If the metrics shift, the loans become callable." Owen sat back. "The loans are for approximately $600 million. The room was very quiet. "They built an empire," Naomi said, more to herself than to him, "on a foundation they didn't bother to understand." "They built it on you," Owen said simply. "And they didn't know." The notices went out on a Monday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, as Naomi had requested. She was not there to watch them arrive. She was at Helix One's research floor, reviewing patient data safety protocols with the engineering team, standing at a whiteboard in a gray blazer with her hair pulled back, discussing the kind of problem she had dedicated her adult life to solving. She had learned, a long time ago, that the best way to keep her hands steady was to have them doing something that mattered. She did not need to watch the Calloways receive the notices to know what was happening. She had been through enough board meetings to understand how a crisis lands. There's a moment of confusion first. Someone receives a document they don't understand and forwards it to someone who also doesn't understand it. Then there is a second moment where someone who does understand it reads it and goes very still. Then comes the phone calls, fast and overlapping, voices rising in pitch. Then the emergency meeting. Then the panic. She had calculated it would take about 4 hours from the time the notices went out to the first phone call from Tristan. It took 3 hours and 40 minutes. She looked at his name on her phone screen, and she thought about the ultrasound photograph, and she set the phone face down on her desk and went back to the whiteboard. He called again, then Graham, then a number she didn't recognize, which turned out to be Martin Kessler, then Veronica. She ignored them all. This was, she had come to understand, the most powerful move available to her. Not speeches, not confrontations, not the kind of dramatic declarations that look satisfying in imagination and are exhausting in practice. Just silence. The silence of someone who has already made every decision that needed to be made and sees no purpose in discussing them further. The silence, it turned out, was terrifying. She had known about the charity gala 3 weeks before it happened. The Hartwell Medical Foundation Gala was an annual event. Black tie, 400 guests, the kind of evening where healthcare executives and philanthropists circled each other and checked their positioning in the room. The Calloways had always attended. Naomi had helped plan 3 of the last 4. She had arranged sponsorships, managed guest lists, cultivated the relationships that made the evening feel effortless to everyone else. This year, the invitation that arrived at her apartment listed Tristan Calloway and Camille Laurent as presenting guests. They were to be formally introduced as a couple. The pregnancy had already been announced in the society pages. Naomi had read about it on her phone at 6:30 on a Thursday morning, over coffee, in her quiet new apartment, the notification appearing between a news alert and a reminder about a Helix One board call. She had read the announcement twice. She had set down her coffee. She had gone for a run. She attended the gala because she had been invited by the foundation's director, a woman named Sandra Keene who genuinely respected Naomi's work and had called personally to extend the invitation. She attended because removing herself from public life was not something she was willing to do. She had not been wrong. She had not done anything that required hiding. She wore a dress the color of midnight blue, simple and precise, and she arrived without a companion and without apology, and she stood in the room the way she stood in any room, like she belonged in it, because she did. The moment Tristan saw her, she watched something flicker across his face. Surprise, then something more complicated. He was standing with Camille on his arm, and a small group of people had arranged themselves around them in the way people do with a couple they are celebrating. And when his eyes found Naomi across the room, the group momentarily lost his attention. Camille noticed. Her gaze followed his, found Naomi, and then returned to him with an expression that said something had been decided. Naomi turned away and began speaking to Sandra Keene about the Foundation's technology grant proposal. She was aware, throughout the evening, of how she was being looked at. Some of the guests were kind, people who knew her, who respected her work, who crossed the room to speak to her and made sure she knew they weren't choosing side because they didn't see it as a competition. But some of the looks were different. Speculative. Slightly pitying. The look that people give someone they believe has been left behind. She recognized that look. She had seen it on her mother's face, years ago, before she understood what it meant. She did not let it change her posture. What she did not expect, what she had underestimated, perhaps the only thing in this entire sequence she had underestimated, was Camille Laurent's publicist. Her name was Sabrina Okafor. She ran a boutique communications firm that specialized in reputation management and narrative control, and she was, by every professional measure, extraordinarily good at her job. Naomi had heard of her but hadn't thought much about it. She understood. over the following 2 weeks that she should have. The first article appeared on a Tuesday. A lifestyle blog, not particularly credible, but with enough followers to see the story. It described an unnamed source close to the Calloway family expressing concern about a recent divorcee who was struggling emotionally and having difficulty accepting the end of the marriage. The article didn't name Naomi directly. It didn't have to. The details were specific enough for anyone paying attention. The second article was different. A mid-entertainment news outlet, the kind of site that existed in the uncomfortable space between gossip and journalism. It used her name. It described her as emotionally fragile and unable to move forward. There was a photograph taken at the gala, she realized, when she examined it. Someone had photographed her in a moment when she was standing alone, between conversations, and in the stillness of that moment her face had held the expression it always held when she wasn't performing ease for anyone. Precise, interior, focused on something no one else could see. In the photograph, she looked devastated. She had not been devastated. She had been thinking about a patient data encryption problem. The third piece was on a major platform and included quotes from multiple sources close to the situation. It used the word breakdown. It suggested she had been asked to leave the hospital that day. Naomi read all 3 articles on the same morning, sitting at her kitchen table with a second cup of coffee, and when she finished reading the third one, she sat very still for a moment. Then she called Rebecca. "I see it," Rebecca said before Naomi could speak. "I'm already on it." "What's the exposure?" "Defamation is possible on the third piece. The first 2 are careful enough to be technically defensible. But Naomi, the bigger issue isn't legal. The bigger issue is that this is a coordinated campaign and it's going to continue." "I know. What do you want to do?" Naomi looked out the window. "Keep the legal options in reserve. Don't respond publicly. Don't issue statements. Don't defend. That's going to feel like silence while they talk." "Good," Naomi said. "Let them talk." She went back to the house once. Not because she needed to. She still had keys. That was an oversight on Tristan's part, or perhaps a deliberate one. She wasn't sure which, and she went back on a Wednesday afternoon while she knew the house would be empty because Tristan had a board meeting and Camille did not yet live there. Not officially. Not yet. She didn't go to reclaim anything. She didn't go to look at what had been theirs together. She went because there was one specific thing she needed, and she didn't want to send someone else for it. Her mother's necklace. Amelia Everhart had died when Naomi was 22. The death had not been dramatic in the way of accidents or sudden illness. It had been the quieter, slower tragedy of a medical system that failed to communicate properly. A surgical record error. A medication interaction that the right information would have prevented. Amelia had gone into a routine procedure and had not come out of it because somewhere in the chain of data transfer between departments, something critical had been lost. She had died because information failed. Naomi had been sitting in a waiting room when a doctor came to tell her. She had been 22 years old and entirely alone, and the doctor had looked sorry in the way doctors look when they know the system failed and don't have words for it that won't become a lawsuit. The necklace was a small thing. A fine gold chain with a pendant in the shape of a helix. A double helix. Actually, delicate and precise, the kind of thing you didn't notice until you were close enough to see the detail. Amelia had worn it every day. She had been a biologist before she became a businesswoman, and she'd had the pendant made when she founded Helix One, which she named not for corporate branding reasons, but because she genuinely believed that information, like DNA, was the structure upon which everything else depended. When Naomi started the company after her mother's death, she had put on the necklace and she had not taken it off for 3 years. She had taken it off on her wedding day and replaced it with the diamond Tristan gave her. She had put her mother's necklace in the small cedar box she kept on the vanity in her dressing room. Now the cedar box was gone. She found it in the storage unit beneath the staircase, which was where the house staff had apparently been instructed to put her belongings, her personal things, the things that were undeniably, specifically hers, packed into boxes and stored in the dark under the stairs like a collection of items whose owner had not yet been confirmed. She stood in the storage unit looking at the boxes. She did not cry right then. She opened the cedar box, which was on the top of the nearest stack, and she took the necklace out, and she put it around her neck where it belonged. She felt it settle against her collarbone, and something in her chest that had been slightly wrong for weeks shifted back into its correct position. Then she went back to her car, and she sat in the driver's seat, and she pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, and she allowed herself, for exactly the time it took to breathe in and out 3 times, to feel all of it. All 6 years. All the quiet sacrifices. All the problems she had solved without credit. All the love she had given to someone who had finally shown her, in the clearest possible way, exactly what he thought it was worth. She breathed in. She breathed out. She breathed in again. Then she started the car and drove back to her apartment and went to work. The Calloway board met in emergency session on a Thursday morning, 4 to 7 days after the divorce settlement was filed. Naomi knew the meeting was happening because Owen kept her informed, carefully and within the bounds of what was legally appropriate. She knew that Graham Calloway had spent 3 days calling every financial contact he had, trying to understand what was coming and how to stop it. She knew that Tristan had finally engaged his own team of attorneys who had spent those same 3 days reading through contracts that should have been read years ago. She knew that someone on the Calloway side had determined that all roads led back to Helix 1, and that all roads within Helix 1 led back to Naomi. She knew, in other words, that the board meeting was not a strategy session. It was a reckoning. But she wasn't going to wait for the board meeting. Rebecca Sterlington walked into Calloway Health Alliance's headquarters building at 9:45 on Thursday morning. She was wearing a blazer the color of a storm front, carrying a single leather folder, and she walked with the particular stride of someone who has read every document in the building more carefully than the people who wrote them. She was announced in the lobby. She was expected. Graham Calloway had agreed to a meeting, assuming it was a negotiation, the kind where someone comes in with a number and you counter and eventually land somewhere in the middle, the kind of meeting he had won many times in his career. He had not won a meeting with Rebecca Sterlington before. The boardroom on the 38th floor was full when she arrived. Graham at the head of the table, Tristan to his right, 3 board members in their usual chairs. The lender's representatives. The restructuring attorney the Calloways had engaged. Tristan's personal lawyer. A man from Summit Crest Partners who had flown in from New York that morning and had not smiled once since arriving. Rebecca sat down, opened the folder, and did not say good morning. "I'm here on behalf of Naomi Everhart," she said, "and I'm going to explain what is happening to your company. I will do this once, clearly, and without negotiation, because there is nothing to negotiate. There are only facts." Graham started to speak. Rebecca continued as though he hadn't. Calloway Health Alliance's operational infrastructure is managed, at its core, by Helix 1 systems. Helix 1 holds the primary licensing agreements for your patient data architecture, your records compliance systems, and your emergency recovery protocols. For 6 years, you have operated under pricing structures that represent a combined subsidy of approximately $430 million compared to market rate. She paused, not for effect, but to let the number settle. You have also operated with deferred payment obligations totaling $162 million. Those deferrals were conditional. The condition no longer applies. Tristan was staring at her. The man from Summit Crest had opened his own folder. "In addition," Rebecca said, "your expansion loan covenants with Summit Crest Partners require maintenance of operational cost stability within a margin of 12%. The contract restructuring that is currently being processed will move your technology costs from approximately $9 million annually to approximately $61 million. That is a change of 578%, which is somewhat outside the 12% margin." The room was silent in the way rooms go silent when everyone has the same thought at the same time, and nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. Graham Calloway, who had built an empire through a combination of genuine business acumen and very fortunate protection he had never thought to examine, said, very quietly, "Who did this?" Rebecca reached into her folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper. She slid it across the table toward him. It was a corporate registration document. Clean, official, stamped. Helix 1 Systems. Founded by Amelia Everhart. Majority ownership transferred upon founder's death to Amelia's sole surviving heir, Naomi Everhart. "Who is Helix 1? Rebecca said. "Naomi Everhart is Helix 1. She has always been Helix One. She founded it with her mother. She rebuilt it after her mother's death. She grew it into the infrastructure company that your entire organization depends upon. She subsidized your operation for 6 years because she believed in what you were building together. Rebecca closed her folder. You demanded a clean break. You will have one. Every protection, every favorable term, every deferred obligation, all of it will restructure to market rate over the next 90 days. That process is already underway. She looked at Tristan. He was looking at the registration document. The company you thought was your vendor, Rebecca said, was your wife. If you're watching this and you're wondering how a woman who signed divorce papers in a hospital bed managed to rearrange the entire foundation of a billion-dollar empire without raising her voice once, keep watching. Because we are only halfway through Naomi Everhart's story, and where she goes from here is going to make everything you've just seen look like the beginning. And if this story is hitting you somewhere real, if you've ever given everything to someone who mistook your quiet for your weakness, hit that like button right now, because this channel exists for exactly that reason. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we are just getting started. The silence that followed Rebecca Sterlington's presentation lasted approximately 6 seconds. Then Graham Calloway spoke, and the word he chose was not something that belonged in a boardroom, and it was directed at no one in particular, because there was no one in the room he could direct it at who would make any difference. Tristan said nothing. He sat very still, which was unusual for him. Tristan Calloway was a man of motion. He talked with his hands. He stewed when he was stressed. He paced when he was thinking. Naomi had always been able to read his state of mind by whether he was sitting or standing. He sat now, and he was very still, and he looked at the corporate registration document in front of him the way a person looks at a letter from a doctor when they are not sure whether to open it. He already knew what was in it. That was the problem. This is a mistake, said the restructuring attorney the Calloways had retained, a man named Pierce who specialized in exactly this kind of situation and who sounded less certain than his reputation suggested. The contract terms will be subject to challenge. The governance amendments were executed 14 months ago, Rebecca said, properly witnessed, properly filed, and legally airtight. My office has spent 6 weeks confirming this with 3 separate outside counsel firms. There is no challenge that will succeed. Every contract has vulnerabilities. Not this one. Pierce stopped. The man from Summit Crest Partners, whose name was Alan Marsh and who had flown in from New York specifically to assess whether his firm's $600 million exposure was about to change categories, looked at Graham Calloway and said, "We need to speak privately." "We need to speak to Naomi," Graham said. His voice was different now. The authority had gone out of it. He sounded like something structural had shifted inside him and he was still standing out of habit. "My client," Rebecca said, gathering her folder, "is not available for meetings at this time. She's my daughter-in-law." "She was your daughter-in-law, per the settlement your attorney drafted." Rebecca stood. "If you have formal legal correspondence, my office will receive it. Good morning." She walked out. The room behind her had the quality of a space where something has just been detonated. The blast already passed, the walls still standing, everyone beginning to understand the extent of the damage. Naomi was on a call with the Helix One engineering team when Owen Prescott appeared in the doorway of her office and gave her a single nod. She held up one finger to the engineering team, muted herself, and looked at Owen. "How did they take it?" she asked. He considered this for a moment. Graham said something I won't repeat. Tristan didn't say anything. Marsh from Summit Crest asked to speak privately with Graham immediately. "I think we can assume the expansion conversations are entering a new chapter." She unmuted the call. "Let's reschedule the second half of this for Thursday," she said to the engineering team. "I have something to attend to." She ended the call, put her phone face down on the desk, and sat back in her chair. She had expected to feel something at this moment. Relief, maybe, or the particular satisfaction of a plan completing. What she actually felt was something quieter. Not satisfaction, but more like the feeling after a long illness finally breaks, when the fever is gone and the room is just a room again and you realize you have work to do. She had work to do. Callaway Health Alliance's stock which was privately held and therefore not subject to market fluctuation in the conventional sense, was nonetheless tracked closely by its lenders, its board, and the industry analysts who had spent 3 years declaring it the most exciting healthcare infrastructure expansion in the region. Over the 3 weeks that followed Rebecca Sterlington's visit to the boardroom, the picture those analysts had been drawing began to change in uncomfortable ways. Summit Crest Partners formally notified the alliance that expansion funding was being placed under review pending updated operational cost assessments. This was, in the language of finance, a polite way of saying that someone had pulled a structural pin and everyone was waiting to see what fell. The expansion projects, 2 new facilities in the northern region, a technology modernization program that had been announced with significant fanfare, a data center partnership that 3 board members had championed as the future of the company, were paused. Pause was also a polite word. The board members who had championed the expansion began to distance themselves from it with the speed of people who had just noticed they were standing on something that was sinking. There were conversations about governance. There were conversations about fiduciary responsibility. There were conversations, not yet official but absolutely real, about whether the leadership that had overseen this situation, specifically the leadership represented by the names Graham and Tristan Calloway, had been appropriately managing the company's dependencies. Graham had never been audited by his own board. He discovered, at 63, that it felt exactly as unpleasant as he had always assumed. The audit was launched quietly. It was the kind of audit that starts with questions about contract management and then finds, as it inevitably does, that contract management connects to everything else. There were questions about what the leadership had known about the Helix One pricing structures. There were questions about due diligence. There were questions about whether the extraordinary favorable terms had ever been disclosed to the board as a material dependency. They had not been disclosed. Graham had not disclosed them because he had not understood them. He had not understood them because he had never asked. He had never asked because Naomi handled it and things worked. And Graham Calloway was not a man who examined things that worked. That philosophy, applied consistently over 6 years, had led him to this room, with these auditors answering these questions. Tristan drove to Naomi's apartment building on a Saturday morning. He sat in his car in the parking structure for 12 minutes before he went inside. The doorman recognized him. There had been a period, before everything, when Tristan had come here regularly, when the apartment had been Naomi's office-adjacent pied-à-terre rather than her permanent home. The doorman called up. Naomi said to send him. She met him in the lobby, which was a choice. She did not invite him to the apartment. She was wearing dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater, her mother's necklace resting at her collarbone, her hair down. She looked well, better than well. She looked like someone who was sleeping properly and eating properly and whose body had recalibrated to the specific relief of not being married to Tristan Calloway. He looked like he hadn't slept in 3 weeks. Naomi, he said. Tristan. He looked around the lobby, which was empty except for the doorman at a discreet distance. Can we go somewhere? He is fine. He exhaled, ran a hand through his hair. I need to talk to you about what's happening. I know what's happening. Everything we built. Everything I helped you build, she said, and her voice was entirely calm, the way a medical professional's voice is calm when they're delivering a diagnosis. I need to be accurate about that. Naomi. He stepped closer. She did not step back, but her posture changed in a way that made the distance between them very clear. I made mistakes. I know I made mistakes. What Camille and I, he stopped. Started again. It wasn't something I planned. I didn't mean for it to happen the way it happened. You brought your attorney, your girlfriend, and both your parents to my hospital room while I was still attached to Infor. You had already bought nursery furniture. You had already booked a honeymoon. I have seen the credit card statements, Tristan. The planning was done 2 months before you served me papers. She tilted her head slightly. That's not something that happened to you. That's something you did. He said nothing for a moment. When he spoke again, something in his voice had changed. The rehearsed quality was gone. You should have told me. About Helix One. About what you were doing. About all of it. I would have, what? She asked. If you had known I owned the company that kept your alliance running, you would have treated me differently. He stopped. That's the thing, she said. That's exactly the thing. I didn't want to be treated according to what I controlled. I wanted to be treated according to who I was. My husband. My family. She let the words sit. You made that very clear. The alliance is going to fail. The alliance has structural problems that existed before me and will exist regardless of me. What I provided was a foundation. You didn't maintain it, Tristan. You didn't know it was there to maintain. Help me fix it. He said it the way a man says something when he's run out of other options. Whatever you need. Whatever terms you want. I'll agree to them. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the man she had loved for 6 years. The man who had looked at her across a room at a fundraiser and walked directly to her as though she were the only fixed point in the space. The man who had brought an attorney and a pregnant woman to her hospital room. The man who had gone through her home and erased every sign of her from it. I know you will, she said. But I don't need you to. She walked back to the elevator. He watched her go. She did not look back. Camille Laurent's situation deteriorated in a way that was more visible to the public than anything happening inside the Calloway boardroom. Because Camille's world was public by design. She was a lifestyle influencer with 700,000 followers, a brand that was built on aspiration and curated image, and a significant portion of her commercial value was attached to the Calloway name and the elevation that came with it. When the first story appeared in a financial news outlet about Calloway Health Alliance's restructuring troubles, it was a business story. When the second story appeared, it began to ask questions. When the third story ran a timeline that included the divorce, including, because the society pages had covered it, the hospital room detail, Camille's comments section became something she could no longer manage. Her sponsor relationships began to renegotiate. A skincare brand that had renewed her contract in January sent a letter in March about brand alignment review. A fitness equipment company that had announced a 6-figure partnership in February requested a conversation about timeline adjustments. Sabrina Okafor's communications firm, which had been managing both Camille's public narrative and the campaign against Naomi, found itself in the unusual position of having a client whose story had turned against her faster than the usual news cycle. It was the Naomi campaign that undid Sabrina, ultimately. One of the journalists who had been given access to Sabrina's talking points about Naomi being emotionally fragile and unable to move forward had, it turned out, kept records of exactly who had provided those talking points and in what form. When a media ethics reporter began pulling on that thread, it unraveled quickly. The practice of seeding false narratives about a private individual, a recently divorced woman who had been hospitalized, no less, was not one that held up well under examination. The story ran on a Saturday morning. By Monday, 3 of Sabrina's major clients had issued statements. By Tuesday, the statements were everywhere. Sabrina's firm did not close immediately. These things rarely happen immediately. But the pipeline of new business that had been accumulating dried up within a week, and the current clients who remained did so quietly and with the particular caution of people who know they may have to exit soon. Naomi read about it the way she read everything involving this situation, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee, processing the information without comment, and then setting it aside and going to work. She did not celebrate. Celebration suggested that these outcomes had been the goal. They had not been the goal. The goal had been what it had always been, from the beginning, from the moment she sat in the cold of a bathroom with the water running and decided what she was going to do. The goal was to be free. To have the space and the resources and the clarity to do the work she actually cared about. Everything else was consequence. The interview request came from a journalist named Josephine Tran, who wrote long-form profiles for a magazine that took healthcare policy seriously and had been covering the patient safety beat for 11 years. She reached out through Helix One's communications office with a specific pitch. She was writing about the intersection of data infrastructure and patient outcomes, and she wanted to interview Naomi Everhart as a founder and innovator in the space. Not about the divorce. Not about the Calloways. About the work. Naomi agreed. They met in a conference room at Helix One on a Wednesday afternoon. Josephine Tran was a small, precise woman with a notebook and a digital recorder and the particular quality of attention that makes people say things they hadn't planned to say. She asked good questions. She had clearly done her homework. Helix One's patient data architecture has a specific focus on communication continuity, she said. That's not the standard industry approach. Where does that come from? Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother." She told Josephine Tran about Amelia Everhart in the same way she thought about her, carefully, with precision, without the softening that grief sometimes imposes on memory. She told her about the surgical record error, the medication interaction, the chain of failures in data transfer that had cost Amelia her life during a routine procedure. She told her what it meant to be 22 and sitting in a waiting room when a doctor comes out with that specific look. "I understood afterward," Naomi said, "that she had not died of a medical error in the conventional sense. She had died of an information error. The medicine existed that would have protected her. The knowledge existed. It just wasn't where it needed to be when it needed to be there." She paused. "That problem is still everywhere. It is still killing people. And it's solvable. That's what I can't get past. It's solvable." Josephine Tran was writing quickly. "The work I'm most proud of," Naomi continued, "is not the business metrics. It's the protocol we built 3 years ago that ensures medication records transfer within 90 seconds across all connected facilities. 90 seconds. There have been patients in our network who would not be alive without that protocol. I know at least 4 of them by name." She looked at her hands. "That's the thing. That's always been the thing." The interview ran 4,000 words and did not mention Tristan Calloway once. The Amelia Hope Initiative was announced at a Helix One board meeting in early spring, 3 months after the formal completion of the divorce proceedings and 2 months after the Calloway audit had concluded with findings that resulted in Graham's removal from his executive position and Tristan's suspension from the board pending further review. The initiative was a foundation endowed with a portion of Helix One's proceeds and structured as an independent nonprofit focused on patient data safety and medical communication reform. It would fund research, provide training, and advocate for policy changes in medical record standards. It was named for Amelia Everhart, who had been a biologist and a businesswoman and a mother who wore a necklace shaped like a double helix because she believed that information was the structure upon which everything else depended. The announcement was covered by 7 healthcare publications and 2 general interest outlets. Owen Prescott, sitting in the back of the boardroom, watched Naomi present the initiative's structure and goals and thought about all the years he had watched her solve problems without anyone knowing she was solving them. "Questions," she said when she finished. The board had questions. They were substantive questions, because the board was full of people who understood the work, and the conversation that followed was the kind Naomi had always preferred: direct, specific, oriented toward solving something real. Owen did not ask a question. He sat in the back and thought about a woman who had turned her grief into infrastructure, her rage into reform, and her silence into the most effective strategy he had ever witnessed. He thought, she has been doing this her whole life. She saw Tristan one more time. It was at an industry conference in the fall, the kind of event that the healthcare world convenes regularly, bringing together executives and researchers and regulators and advocates, in which both of them attended because both of them worked in the industry, and the industry was large enough to contain them both. She saw him from across the atrium before the morning keynote. He was standing with a small group, coffee in hand, and he was talking, but not in the way he used to talk at these events, with the expansive, taking the room energy of someone who knows he is worth watching. He was quieter now, smaller in some way that had nothing to do with his physical dimensions. He saw her. She did not look away. She held his gaze for a moment with the equanimity of someone who has processed everything there was to process about this person and arrived, on the other side, at something that was not quite peace but was very close to it. Then she turned and walked toward the registration table, because she had a panel to moderate in an hour and she wanted to review her notes first. He crossed the atrium. "Naomi." She stopped, turned. He looked like he had rehearsed this again, but whatever the rehearsal had produced had not survived the walk across the atrium, because what came out of his mouth was not polished. "I've been thinking about," I wanted to say. He stopped, looked at her. "You're thriving." "Yes," she said. "The initiative. The protocol work. I read the piece Josephine Tran wrote. I read it twice." She waited. "I think about the hospital room," he said. "Every day. I think about it every day and I can't." He stopped again. "I don't know how you." "Tristan." Her voice was gentle, genuinely gentle, which was different from careful. I don't need an apology. I'm not waiting for one. What happened was what happened, and it is over, and you need to move forward. Is it that easy for you? She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. No, she said, but it's done, and there's too much work to do. She looked at him with something that was not quite warmth and not quite distance, but lived in the space between them that 6 years and everything since had created. Take care of yourself. She walked to the registration table. She collected her badge, which had her name on it in clean black letters, Naomi Everhart, Helix One Systems, and she pinned it to her lapel, and she went to review her notes for the panel. The conference room was full when she walked in, people still finding seats, the murmur of 100 conversations in progress, the particular energy of a space where people who care about the same problems have gathered to try to solve them. She set her notes on the table, adjusted her microphone, and looked out at the room. This was what she had been building toward. Not a boardroom destroyed. Not a dynasty undone. Not a man humbled in an atrium. This room, these people, these problems. The moderator introduced her with a paragraph about Helix One's patient safety work, the Amelia Hope Initiative, and the communication protocol that had, in the 3 years since its implementation, been credited with preventing a number of preventable deaths that the speakers cited carefully because they were real numbers attached to real people. The room applauded. Naomi leaned into the microphone. "Thank you," she said. "I want to start with a specific case, if I may. Not a hypothetical. A real patient, in a real facility, 3 years ago." She talked for 40 minutes. Not about Tristan. Not about the Calloways. Not about divorce settlements or boardrooms or $400 million of quietly redirected subsidy. About a patient. About information. About what happens when the right data is in the right place at the right moment, and what it costs when it isn't. About her mother. About the 37 hospitals that had since implemented the communication protocol. About the work still ahead. She had learned, in the months since the hospital room, the specific geography of her own strength. It was not where she had always assumed it was. She had always thought of her strength as the ability to endure, to absorb, to continue functioning under pressure without showing the seams. That was one kind of strength, and she had it, but it was not the one that mattered most. The one that mattered most was the ability to build. She could build things. She could see what was missing and design what would fill the absence. She could hold a problem at arm's length and examine it until its structure became clear, and then she could work, methodically and without drama, until the structure had been addressed. Her mother had that strength. She had not understood that she had it too until she was 22 years old and standing at her mother's grave thinking about what information had cost. She had understood it more fully, over the following 12 years, every time she had solved a problem quietly and moved on without waiting to be credited. Every time she had absorbed someone else's crisis because she could, and then returned to her own work. Every time she had chosen to protect something she believed in even when the protection required her to be invisible. She had not been invisible. She had been foundational. There was a difference, and it had taken her a long time to understand it clearly. And now that she did, she intended to put it to work. The Amelia Hope Initiative completed its first full year of operations with 11 grants distributed, 42 hospitals enrolled in the training program, and 3 policy proposals submitted to the state legislature for consideration. The research arm had published 2 papers in peer-reviewed journals. Naomi had given 14 public talks and 1 congressional testimony about medical data communication standards. She had not given a single interview about her personal life. She had not needed to. The story had told itself, the way the best stories do. Not through a narrator's insistence, but through the weight of what had actually happened. The woman who had been handed divorce papers in a hospital bed while recovering from surgery had turned out to own the infrastructure that kept her ex-husband's empire breathing. The empire had restructured, painfully and publicly. The ex-husband had learned that the foundation of everything he built had a name, and the name was someone he had discarded. And then she had gone back to work. Not because the work was revenge, because the work was the point. It had always been the point. The necklace rested at her collarbone, her mother's necklace, the double helix, delicate and precise, the structure upon which everything else depended, And Naomi Everhart stood in a room full of people trying to solve a solvable problem, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, exactly like herself. Not the self that had tried to hold a marriage together through quiet sacrifice. Not the self that had absorbed dismissal and converted it into strategy. The self before all of that. The self at 22, standing at her mother's grave, deciding what she was going to build. She had built it. It was still being built. She was still building. The moment they stopped valuing her was the moment she finally learned her worth. And she had never looked back. That's the story of Naomi Everhart. The woman they thought was powerless. The woman who signed the papers, walked out of that hospital room, and quietly changed everything. If this story moved you, if you found yourself thinking about someone in your own life who mistook your silence for your surrender, I want to hear about it. Drop your favorite moment from this story in the comments right now. I read every single one. And if you're new here, if this is the first time you've found this channel, please subscribe. We tell stories about women who were underestimated and then weren't. There are many more where this one came from. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. We'll see you in the next one.